June 17, 1942. Deep in the heart of Nazi Germany. Inside a windowless conference room of the Abner Intelligence Directorate, a senior officer studied a report freshly smuggled from the United States. The agent, who had risked his life to compile it, described a vast new construction project near Ypsilanti, Michigan. It was called the Willow Run plant. According to the report, the Americans were attempting something absurd, building heavy bombers machines of more than 1.5 million individual parts on an assembly line as though they were Ford automobiles. The officer scoffed a bomber. He told his colleagues, "It's not a car. These Americans are fools. They believe they can build aircraft like toys. They will drown in their own arrogance." Laughter filled the room for the Nazis, steeped in the craftsmanship of Messerschmitt and Junker's factories. The idea was laughable. Airplanes required the hands of master engineers, not conveyor belts. A bomber every hour impossible, and yet history would prove them disastrously wrong. Within just 3 years, Willow Run would stand as the largest factory under a single roof in the world, its mile-long assembly line producing a complete B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes. By war's end, this single facility had delivered more than 8,600 bombers, nearly as many as the entire Luftwaffe could build of all types in the same period. Nazi spies, once so dismissive, would find themselves filing reports of disbelief. The arsenal of democracy had transformed the automobile industry into a bomber factory, and the right could not keep up. To understand why this seemed impossible, one must remember the scale of the challenge. A B-24 Liberator was no automobile. It stretched 67 feet in length with a wingspan of 110 feet. Its engines alone required 336,000 individual parts. Each aircraft demanded more than 313,000 rivets hammered into its aluminum skin and over 5,000 man-hours of labor. In 1940, building even one bomber required weeks of delicate craftsmanship by highly trained workers. German intelligence analysts looked at these numbers and dismissed Ford's claims. In their view, American industry was soft and chaotic. The Americans are consumers, not warriors. One report to Berlin observed, "They waste their resources on Coca-Cola refrigerators and motor cars. They cannot sustain a war of attrition." Hitler himself famously sneered. "The Americans are only good at making razor blades in Michigan." They called it the fulfillment of the impossible. Willow Run was a place many thought could never produce at the scale required. Yet the assembly lines moved with tenacious precision. Yet what the Nazis could not see, what their spies failed to understand, was that the very same assembly line methods that had put a Model T in every driveway were now being redirected toward war. Henry Ford's dream of mechanized production, perfected in Detroit's automobile plants, was about to be unleashed on the skies. For Germany, the danger lay not in a single bomber plant, but in the philosophy behind it, the belief that anything, even the most complex aircraft, could be standardized, broken down into parts, and built by the millions. While German factories obsessed over quality and craftsmanship, the Americans aimed for scale, speed, and relentless. And as the Allies would soon discover, in a global war of attrition, it was not the beautifully engineered aircraft that decided victory. It was the sheer number of machines in the sky. The name most often tied to Willow Run was Henry Ford. By 1941, Ford was already a legend, the man who had revolutionized manufacturing by putting America and much of the world on wheels. His Model T, first produced in 1908, had changed history by demonstrating that complex machinery could be mass-produced cheaply, quickly, and reliably. The assembly line was his masterpiece, a process that cut the time to build a car from 12 hours to just 93 minutes. But Ford was not the only figure at the heart of this bomber revolution. In truth, the Willow Run miracle was as much the work of Edsel Ford, Henry's son, and a team of brilliant engineers and managers who believed that America's auto industry could pivot to war. Where Henry Ford was stubborn, skeptical of war, and in declining health, Edsel and his engineers were the ones who pushed the vision forward. They believed the same principles that built cars by the millions could build planes by the thousands. The U.S. government had doubts. In 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt had challenged the nation to produce 50,000 warplanes per year, a figure that stunned even his own advisors. At the time, the United States was building fewer than 3,000 annually. Critics sneered that Roosevelt had been carried away by fantasy, and yet it was this challenge that Ford seized. When the Army Air Forces selected the consolidated B-24 Liberator as a long-range bomber, they turned to Ford to see if it could be mass-produced. The Liberator, though less glamorous than Boeing's B-17 Flying Fortress, had one advantage. It was designed with modular components, meaning in theory its parts could be broken down and standardized for an assembly line. Ford declared he would build one bomber an hour. Newspapers reported this with awe and skepticism. The New York Times wrote in 1941, "If Henry Ford can mass-produce the B-24 as he did the Model T, it will rank as one of the greatest achievements of modern industry." But critics scoffed. Charles Lindbergh, once a hero to Ford, privately doubted that airplanes could ever be built like automobiles. Even the Army Air Forces had little faith. They signed contracts with Ford, but also hedged their bets, continuing to order bombers from traditional aircraft plants. The stakes were immense. If Willow Run succeeded, it would provide the Allies with an unstoppable flood of bombers. If it failed, it would confirm Nazi assumptions that America's industrial might was overrated. Willow Run was unlike anything the world had ever seen. Located on farmland west of Detroit, its construction began in April 1941. Designed by the legendary industrial architect Albert Kahn, the plant covered more than 3.5 million square feet, the largest factory under a single roof at the time. Its assembly line stretched a mile long, bending in the shape of an enormous L so that aircraft could roll directly out onto an airfield for test flights. Inside, the scale was staggering. Over 40,000 workers were employed at Willow Run, many of them young women who had never held industrial jobs before. They came to be known as Rosies, after the famous image of Rosie the Riveter. Immigrants, farmers, and homemakers alike poured into the plant, working around the clock in 3 shifts. The average worker earned 75 cents an hour, and for many women it was the first taste of independence and wages outside the home. It was these anonymous workers, not just Henry Ford or his son Edsel, who became the true heroes of the Willow Run story. They were the ones who drilled rivets, bolted panels, wired engines, and tested hydraulics. And they would prove that America's strength lay not in a single man's genius, but in the collective effort of a democratic nation mobilized for war. At first, however, Willow Run was a disaster. The plant was not fully completed when production began, and aircraft parts were often stored outside in the mud. The sheer size of the facility created logistical nightmares. It could take workers half an hour just to walk from one end of the factory to the other. Machinery broke down, tools went missing, and quality control was abysmal. In early 1942, the first B-24s produced at Willow Run were so riddled with defects that the Army Air Forces refused to accept them. Leaky fuel tanks, warped fuselages, and faulty wiring plagued the line. Inspectors reported that as many as 2/3 of completed aircraft had to be returned for rework. The dream of a bomber every hour seemed laughable. Newspapers began to question the wisdom of the project. The Detroit Free Press wrote, "The Willow Run experiment may prove too ambitious. Bombers are not Fords and cannot be built by unskilled hands." Politicians muttered that Roosevelt had gambled too much faith on Ford. Henry Ford himself, increasingly detached, dismissed critics but offered little practical help. The workers bore the brunt of these struggles. For many women and newcomers, the work was exhausting and unfamiliar. Riveting thousands of holes into aluminum panels left hands blistered and muscles aching. Mistakes were common, and supervisors barked at them to keep up with impossible quotas. One worker recalled, "They told us we were building airplanes, but half the time it felt like we were just fixing yesterday's mistakes." Even the Germans were receiving reports that Willow Run was failing. Nazi agents in the United States cabled back that production was far behind schedule and that American workers lacked the discipline to succeed. A Luftwaffe intelligence summary in late 1942 smugly concluded, "The United States cannot mass-produce strategic bombers in significant numbers. The Reich retains superiority in the air." But behind the scenes, a transformation was beginning. Managers at Willow Run reorganized assembly lines, standardizing tools and parts. Training programs were launched for unskilled workers. Experienced engineers from aircraft firms were brought in to teach automobile workers the unique skills of aviation construction. Gradually, the chaos gave way to order. One crucial breakthrough was the rethinking of the assembly process. Instead of building planes in sections scattered across the plant, engineers reorganized production so that the fuselage, wings, engines, and tail were each built in parallel, then brought together at the final line. This innovation would cut days from the construction process. The turnaround was slow, but steady. By late 1942, Willow Run was delivering a handful of bombers each month. By early 1943, production reached one bomber per day. Critics began to quiet. Skeptics began to watch in awe. The dream of a bomber every hour was still distant, but it no longer seemed impossible. By the spring of 1943, the nightmare days of confusion at Willow Run were fading into memory. The lessons learned from hundreds of mistakes were now being baked into the system. Where once chaos reigned, now there was rhythm. Where workers once stumbled, now they marched with practiced efficiency. The bomber plant was beginning to deliver. The statistics tell the story best. In 1942, Willow Run had managed to turn out only 56 bombers for the entire year, an embarrassing figure, far below expectations. But in 1943, production skyrocketed. 1,600 Liberators rolled out of the plant. By 1944, the miracle was complete. Willow Run was producing one finished bomber every 63 minutes, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That meant more than 650 aircraft per month, and by the end of the war, the total output would reach over 8,600. For comparison, in 1943, the entire German aircraft industry produced about 25,000 planes of all types: fighters, bombers, reconnaissance. In that same year, American industry, fueled by Ford and other manufacturers, built nearly 86,000 aircraft. The Nazis' disbelief had turned into horror. The turning point came not just from efficiency, but from culture. The workforce at Willow Run had transformed into a hardened army of its own. Women, who made up nearly a third of the workforce, proved indispensable. They learned to rivet faster, cut metal more precisely, and handle delicate instruments once thought beyond their ability. Photographs of women standing atop bomber wings, drill guns in hand, became iconic symbols of America's industrial war. One worker, a young mother named Helen, later recalled, "We were told every rivet mattered. Every mistake could cost a crew their lives. We worked with that in our hearts every day. This sense of purpose transformed ordinary laborers into soldiers on the home front. The factory also became a melting pot of America itself. Immigrants from Poland, Italy, and Eastern Europe worked side by side with farmers from the Midwest and black workers migrating north from the Jim Crow South. Willow Run was not always free of prejudice. Strikes and tensions sometimes erupted, but over time, the urgency of war forced collaboration. Each bomber that rolled off the line carried the sweat of thousands from every walk of life. Even the engineering challenges began to fall. At first, Ford's engineers had struggled to standardize complex aircraft parts, but by 1943 they had devised new jigs, tools, and fixtures that ensured precise alignment and rapid assembly. Components like wings and tail sections arrived at Willow Run from subcontractors across the country, then snapped into place like pieces of an enormous puzzle. What once seemed impossible was now routine. The Army Air Forces began to notice. General Henry Hap Arnold, chief of the U.S. Army Air Forces, visited Willow Run in mid-1943 and marveled at what he saw. He later wrote, "The spectacle was almost beyond comprehension. To see these immense machines moving down the line, each hour another liberator ready for flight." For the first time, America had proven that it could not only match Germany's production, it could bury it under an avalanche. And this was not just an industrial triumph, but a strategic one. Every bomber rolling off the line meant another squadron to pound Germany's cities, factories, and oil refineries. Every 63 minutes, another blow against the Reich. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how ordinary it all became. By 1944, Willow Run workers no longer saw the production of a bomber in an hour as miraculous. It was just their job. The extraordinary had become routine, and that, more than anything, was what terrified the enemy. America's ability to turn impossibility into normality. Meanwhile, reports trickled back to Berlin. Nazi intelligence agents, once so dismissive, now wrote with alarm. One intercepted document noted, "The United States has achieved an industrial tempo hitherto unseen in human history. If this continues, no number of German victories can offset such overwhelming material superiority." The Nazis had laughed at the idea of a bomber built like a car. Now, those same bombers were appearing over Hamburg, Bremen, and Berlin in swarms too vast to stop. By 1944, the results of Willow Run's achievement could be measured not just in production figures but in firestorms across Europe. The B-24 Liberators rolling off the line every 63 minutes were no longer abstract machines of rivets and aluminum. They were the spearhead of America's air war against Hitler's Reich. The 8th Air Force, operating from bases in England, relied heavily on Liberators built at Willow Run. Each B-24 carried a crew of 10 men and up to 8,000 pounds of bombs. With a range of 2,000 miles, it could reach the industrial heart of Germany, striking oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, and aircraft plants. And thanks to Ford, they were arriving faster than the Luftwaffe could shoot them down. The scale of this campaign was unprecedented. In August 1943, during Operation Tidal Wave, more than 170 Liberators launched one of the most daring raids of the war, flying at treetop level to strike the oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania. Nearly a third of the bombers were lost, but the raid demonstrated the reach of America's new bomber fleet. Many of those planes had been born at Willow Run. By 1944, the skies over Germany grew thick with bombers. On February 20th, 1944, the Allies launched Big Week, a coordinated campaign to cripple the Luftwaffe. More than 3,800 bombers and 3,500 escort fighters took to the skies over 5 days, overwhelming German defenses. Thousands of tons of bombs rained down on aircraft factories, while swarms of P-51 Mustangs, another product of American industry, hunted German fighters. The Luftwaffe was broken, its pilot corps gutted. Without Ford's relentless output, such a campaign would have been impossible. The ultimate test came on June 6, 1944, D-Day. As Allied troops stormed the beaches of Normandy, more than 11,000 aircraft supported the invasion. Among them were thousands of B-24 Liberators, hammering German positions, severing rail lines, and isolating reinforcements. The bombers built by Willow Run were not just symbols of America's power. They were instruments of liberation, clearing the way for soldiers to land, fight, and free a continent. Numbers tell the story. By mid-1944, Willow Run was producing more than 14 bombers per day. Each week, nearly 100 aircraft rolled off the line. In the skies, this meant entire new groups of bombers entering combat monthly, faster than Germany could replace its losses. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland later admitted, "We knew then the war was lost." We could not shoot down as many bombers as the Americans could build. The B-24 became the most produced heavy bomber in history, with over 18,000 built during the war, nearly half of them from Ford's lines. German intelligence had once dismissed the claim that a bomber could be built like a car. Now, their cities were burning under the wings of those very machines. The irony was cruel. German spies had laughed at Ford's ambition. Now, Ford's assembly line was delivering the very bombers that reduced the Reich to rubble. Every 63 minutes, another blow. Every hour, another reminder that in a war of attrition, it was not brilliance or bravery alone that decided the outcome. It was the capacity to outproduce, outbuild, and outlast. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self. Fuel shortages grounded planes that had once dominated European skies. Factories, bombed relentlessly by liberators and flying fortresses, struggled to produce replacements. Training schools for new pilots were reduced to sending teenagers into combat with only a handful of flight hours. And all the while, Willow Run kept producing. Every hour, another bomber. Every day, another squadron. German diaries and reports capture the despair. One Luftwaffe officer wrote in December 1944, "We fight like lions, but it is useless. For every bomber we destroy, 10 more appear." Their factories are not factories. They are volcanoes, spitting out machines endlessly. Even high-ranking Nazi officials began to admit the hopelessness. Albert Speer, Hitler's Minister of Armaments, recalled in his memoirs, "When I studied the production numbers of American aircraft, particularly the B-24 from the Ford plant, I knew we were finished. No amount of efficiency in Germany could compensate for such overwhelming output." Spies, who had once mocked Ford, now reported with disbelief. A captured Abwehr file discovered after the war described Willow Run as a facility without precedent in history, producing heavy bombers at the speed of automobiles. If this continues, it is impossible for Germany to achieve parity. On the front lines, German soldiers felt the consequences. In France, one infantryman described Allied bombers as a steel roof above us, unbroken, unending. Day after day, new squadrons come. We destroy some, but still they come. To men in the trenches, the sight of American bombers blotting out the sky was the most visible symbol of defeat. Meanwhile, in America, workers at Willow Run hardly recognized the magnitude of their achievement. For them, it was simply a job. They labored in sweltering summer heat and bitter Michigan winters, often without ever seeing the planes they built in combat. Yet their fingerprints were on every mission, every bomb dropped on Berlin, every formation that darkened the skies of Europe. The irony was that Ford, once accused of pacifism and even sympathy toward isolationist movements, had become one of the chief suppliers of destruction to Hitler's Reich. The very man whose assembly line had put a car in every driveway now put a bomber in every squadron. By war's end, the truth was undeniable. American industry had not only met Roosevelt's goal of 50,000 planes a year, it had surpassed it. In 1944 alone, U.S. factories produced 96,000 aircraft, more than Germany built in the entire war. Willow Run had proven the model. Mass production could conquer even the most complex machines. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the bombers stopped rolling off the line. Willow Run, once the beating heart of the bomber offensive, began to fall silent. But its legacy was already written in the ruins of German cities, in the shattered Luftwaffe, and in the diary entries of men who had once laughed at America's supposed softness. For the spies who had dismissed it, Willow Run was a bitter lesson. Arrogance had blinded them. They had underestimated the power of democracy, the strength of a free workforce, and the relentless logic of mass production. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Willow Run's mile-long assembly line no longer thundered with the rhythm of production. The factory that had once turned farmland into a volcano of bombers now stood as a monument to what free societies could achieve when pushed to the limit. In less than 4 years, ordinary Americans, farmers' sons, housewives, immigrants, and students had built nearly 9,000 heavy bombers under a single roof. Combined with the rest of America's aircraft industry, they had given the Allies mastery of the skies. For the Germans, the lesson had come too late. They had believed craftsmanship could outmatch mass production, that discipline could outweigh abundance. They had placed their faith in elite pilots, in superior machines, in the genius of a few. But history had chosen differently. It was not the brilliance of a single engineer, but the collective effort of millions of free citizens that won the day. Albert Speer would later reflect with admiration and despair. The American war effort was the greatest surprise of the war. Their aircraft factories, particularly Ford's bomber plant, were a marvel of modern organization. We had no answer. The story of Willow Run is more than an industrial triumph. It is a moral lesson. Dictatorships, by their nature, scorn the individual. They see ordinary men and women as expendable, incapable of greatness. Democracies, by contrast, can harness the will of their people. At Willow Run, every riveter, every machinist, every inspector was part of the fight. They may never have seen combat, but they helped win the war, one bomber at a time. In many ways, the B-24 Liberator symbolized the paradox of modern war. It was a weapon of destruction, raining bombs on cities and factories. But it was also a weapon of liberation, carried on the backs of workers who believed in a better world. Each bomber was not only a machine of war, it was a message to tyrants. You cannot outlast a free people. Today, Willow Run's hangars stand quiet, repurposed for other uses, their wartime clamor a distant echo. But the lesson endures. In an age where arrogance still tempts dictators, and where freedom must still prove its worth, the story of a bomber built every 63 minutes is a reminder that innovation, unity, and faith in ordinary citizens can achieve miracles. The Nazis could not believe it. Their spies laughed at the very idea. But in the end, the sound of Willow Run's assembly line was the sound of their downfall. Every hour, another bomber. Every day, another squadron. Every rivet, another act of defiance against tyranny. And that is why the story of Willow Run matters. Because it reminds us that freedom, when challenged, can summon a power that no dictator can match, the power of millions, working together, building not only machines of war, but the future itself.